Lylan 8.2, August 2nd, 1032 AD. The servant girl had listened to Frida's unexpected apology and accepted it in bewilderment. Then she asked Frida why she had so suddenly come to the realization that she needed to be nicer to people, and she'd answered her honestly. That was a big mistake. An even bigger mistake was when she proved to the servant girl that she could see through her eyes by accurately identifying what she was looking at even with her back turned and eyes covered. The servant girl reported what she had seen to the clergy, and they had come for her. She had undergone hours and hours of interrogation, and she demonstrated to them nothing to indicate that she was guilty of anything but being a good Christian. Her father had told the priest who had been overseeing the interrogation about how Frida disliked the servant girl who had reported her, and that she was probably lying to exact revenge on Frida. The priest, speaking in French, said, "You may be correct. I have uncovered no evidence to suggest that she is or ever was in league with the devil. False accusation is a horrendous crime. Your house servant will need to be punished, and she may face more than the stockade. I will have to pray on it, but she may be bound for the gallows for this affront." Her father followed the priest into the dungeon cell where she was being held. The jailer followed behind them with the keys dangling from his hand. They were coming to release her, and she was just moments from being freed from her shackles. If she would have kept her mouth shut, she would have been able to go home, but she was caught up in the excitement. She could see almost a full 7 seconds into the future by then, and she could already feel the sweet release of her wrists being unbound. She figured that her freedom was secured, and she didn't foresee until it was too late that her words would see not only her shackles tightened, but deliver her a death sentence. Her father told her that she was to be released, and she expressed her relief. Then she made the mistake of using the priest's words spoken from where she could only have heard with the devil's ears. Amid her ramblings declaring her innocence, she said, "It's just like you said. You've uncovered no evidence to suggest that I am in league with the devil. And you said that she may face more than the stockade for this affront," and suggested that she be burnt at the stake on a raft meant to burn and set out to sea, saying that burning and drowning are less than she deserves. Then she suddenly stopped speaking and emitted a loud gasp. Then, frightened, she turned to face the priest, who looked at her with fear and hatred in his eyes. "No, please no," she begged the priest in their native French. He raised a finger to point at her, the billowing sleeve of his gown draping down his arm, and in their common tongue he said, "Witch, you are right. I can think of no more suitable means of execution than that which you have suggested. You then shall die burned at the stake, and then set out to sea." As the men left the room, her shackles bound tighter, she begged her father for mercy. He looked her square in the eye and said the words that she knew were coming, words that were to come from him no matter her pleas. "You are not my daughter, witch. My daughter is dead." She moaned and wailed as never before as they left her alone in the dark dungeon filled with nothing but the dread of her impending doom. Then she remembered that she was brave, and she stopped crying. As the days passed, stomach churning from having been given only rotting food and putrid water, she contemplated her fate, and how if she had not been so hateful and tried to again hurt that poor servant girl, she would be free. Her sight of the future gained more and more time and came faster and faster. At the end of her weeks of confinement, when the procession came to retrieve her, she could already see several minutes ahead in time. As the hour had approached, she faced it down with quiet dignity, and when they pulled her from her cell, she did not fight or beg or cry. The servant girl who had reported her was in the very front of the crowd that had come to watch her die, standing next to her father, who now regarded the servant girl with greater esteem than the rest of the staff, and had been given so much of his attention as of late that she would likely be bound for his bedchambers before long. The wind rushed past them as the crowd watched from the rocky crags of the beach. She was ready to die. She had never been so sick in all her life. Her digestive system had been so ransacked by the meals of rotten food and tainted water she had been given that she no longer excreted her feces voluntarily, but rather there was a constant stream of liquid fecal matter mingled with blood that fell from her. She was racked with dysentery and food poisoning. She was lucky that she hadn't been tortured, but having no need of confession from her, she'd been spared the brand and blade that met the flesh of most who were accused of witchcraft at that time. It didn't matter. The pain in her turning stomach, The burning of her throat from all the vomitus and the destruction of her anus were torture enough. She didn't have strength to fight or cry. As they dragged her toward the raft designed to burn and capsize, Frida saw the high mound of kindling and dried wood which surrounded the vertical wooden plank that which she would be tethered to, and with her sight, she saw herself being tethered to the plank with her arms tied behind her back, even as they still dragged her toward it. Then with her sight, she saw them bring torches down upon the kindling, setting it ablaze, as they brought her arms around and tied her wrists together so tight that blood was drawn. It was surreal for Frida, and there were moments that she wasn't sure whether the pain she was feeling was genuine or from her vision of the future. She didn't say a word as the priest condemned her before the crowd. She did not cry as she met the cold gaze of the man who'd until recently called her daughter. She was brave. Weights were attached to her feet, the blaze was lit, and she was shoved out to sea. In her mind's eye, she had already been burning for several minutes and was near death, so she did not scream as the flames engulfed her, for the pain was nothing new, nothing unexpected. The receding tide carried her swiftly away. Every here and there, a splash of the cool water would hit her skin, but the fire kept burning, and Frida right along with it. Her lungs burned in her chest from the heat and smoke. Her hair was gone, and her skin began to bubble and shrivel. The bones of her shins became exposed as the fire tore the flesh away from them, and then it didn't hurt anymore. All of her nerve endings had been seared, and she no longer felt anything except for serenity. She was certainly not at peace, but she was nearing the end of her torment. She could see it. She could see the moment of her death, but then something changed. As she drifted out into the night, suddenly a large figure emerged from the water and grabbed hold of the raft. It reached into the fire with its other hand and snapped the stake to which she was tethered and submerged her unconscious, nearly brain-dead body into the water, and the burning slowed. The raft went on drifting, blazed more than 10 feet high. The crowd on the shore never noticed that Frida's body had been plucked from the inferno. As far as they were concerned, their witch was still burning and would do so until the raft split and she sank to the bottom with the weights attached to her feet. The giant freed her hands and held her horribly burned body close to his, and he closed his eyes and let his healing powers wash over her. The life returned to her flesh, and her hair grew back. She was clean and naked in his arms without a mark on her when she gasped a fresh breath. Then little Frida, brave Frida, caught a short glimpse of the giant, and she was not afraid. Just as she was going to ask him his name, he touched her temples with the tips of his humongous fingers and said, "Hello, Lylan." Then Frida was gone, passed into the nothingness where those who don't exist hover endlessly, and Lylan looked into the eyes of her love. As they floated in the water, she folded her arms around his neck in a loving embrace and in English said, "Hello, Hemhut." Hemhut turned his eyes to the crowd of Normans on the beach and pointed a stern finger at them. "Shall I destroy them, my love, those who would burn you?" She reveled in the moment, floating in the water with him. It was so rare that she and he were at the same height as the water allowed for, and she placed her hands on his cheeks and turned his head to face hers, and she kissed him on the lips. Then she said, "No," and looked back at the beach, torchlight from the huddled crowd fading in the distance. The Normans play an important role in the future history of the world. Besides, they will shed more blood from the demon spawn than is worth the weight of all their own blood combined tenfold. Leave them to suffer their own misery, and to be suffered by evermore the misery they will bring the world. Our business takes us to the east this time. There is much to be done. Then she climbed to her perch on his shoulder and pointed in the direction she would bid him move, and he moved, cascading through the water. "What must we do?" he asked. "We must first go to Mongolia," she said. "There are 3 that await death there whose absence will shape a very odd chain of events, and then we are off to Far East China, where I must die in 50 days. 50 days is so little time," Hemhut said. "Is there no other way?" "I'm afraid not, Hemhut." Lylan's naked skin glinted in the moonlight in great contrast to the matte, unreflective gray of his mighty shoulder. "The demon is always looking for me. Should I stay even an hour longer, he will find me and all will be lost. Besides, the circumstances of my death are exceedingly important this time. My death will set in motion a sequence of events that will result in the cultivation of a bacterium which will ravage the population of the world, decimating its numbers from around 500 million to around 300 million over a very short period of time, a little over 300 years from now. But in order to do so, my corpse must be fed upon by the right creatures in the right place and time, so that it may sustain the correct bloodline of the pests who will spread it. What will they call this, so that I may know it when it happens? He said. She stared ahead blankly, clearly adrift amid the eyes of the world, aloft his shoulder, and said, "It is a different strain of the same plague that has so before crippled the earth. I dare say it has had as much influence over the course of the future as have I, for it brings so much death and change with it. It will have so many names, Hemhut. In our language in the coming time they will call it the Black Death. It is the same that came in the time of Justinian, if you remember the plague of Justinian, the same that swept through China all those centuries before and ensured the rise of Emperor Qin, whose country would forever after bear his name. The same as has been ravaging man since even before our time, Hemhut. If you remember, science will come to know it as the bubonic plague. Again, my love, this plague is a true scourge. And what of the three we must kill?" he asked. "What will result?" "It is all connected, my love," she said, giving him another quick kiss on the forehead. "The first to die will ensure the birth and rise of a man named Temujin to the title of Genghis Khan. Temujin will found an empire that will engulf many lands. The states of his empire, called Khanites, will make possible much scientific and technological advancement, but more importantly, will give rise to Khan Janabek in the mid-14th century. The second to die will ensure the birth of a Muslim man of seemingly little importance, who will, in the year 1343, be killed in the city of Tana on the Don River because of a marketplace dispute turned riot. He will be killed by an Italian, and because he was a Muslim of the Khanate of Khan Janabek, Janabek will bring an army with him to Tana to demand retribution for the affront to his people. The Genoese of Tana will refuse and taunt him, and Janabek will invade the city. The Genoese who survive the assault on Tana will seek refuge to the south in a larger, more heavily fortified city, the city of Kaffa, but the Khan and his army will pursue them. As the Khan's army spends weeks bombarding the city, news of a plague sweeping through China will reach them just ahead of the Black Death itself. What will happen next is horrific. As the bodies of soldiers stricken with plague begin to pile up in the Khan's ranks, he decides on a particularly gruesome tactic, Hemhut. He orders that the corpses of his dead soldiers be catapulted over the city walls into the mocking faces of the Genoese who scoffed at his dying army, believing themselves immune to the ravages of the plague and convinced that their god had spared them and had smite the Khan's army on their behalf. This will go on for weeks upon weeks, the launching of thousands of foul-smelling, rotting corpses claimed by the plague over the city walls and into Kaffa, and when the vermin responsible for carrying the purveyors of the Black Death also breach the walls to feed upon the many corpses, they bring it into the city with them. Men attacking men with a bombardment of corpses, Hemhut said in disgust. That is one of the most terrible things I can imagine. It only gets worse from here on out, Hemhut, she said. They are a twisted and terrible people. Of course they are going to do terrible things. One of the young soldiers defending Kaffa will die after suffering a mortal wound from being crushed by one of the many bodies that Janabek orders catapulted behind the city walls. One who must die. If he should live, he would sire a bloodline that would see the demon born 2 centuries ahead of when he need come, and so much more will change. Surely some of our people remain, he said. What of them? After the plague has done its work, only 2 of their bloodlines will remain, she said. 1 if we do not kill the 3rd. If the 3rd we must kill will ensure that at least 1 more of our people will survive, he said, then he most certainly must die. Is there no hope for the others? There is no hope at all, she stared, entranced, only half present. In the end, none of our people survive. It is for the best anyway. Exposure to the wicked ways of the demon spawn over the ages has corrupted nearly the whole lot of them. By the time the demon comes, this will be naught but a world full of strangers to us, my love. In the end, none who would have existed in our future paradise will remain by the time it should have long come. All of the human bloodlines will have changed. Instead, there will be only his savages, only the people of Daniel Dwyer. No amount of cruelty seems to satiate them, Hemhut. They do such horrible things to one another. Witnessing it is almost too much to bear." "Are there none among them you would spare? No good people remaining?" he asked. "There are only those who are better than the worst," she said. "Even the best of them hide some transgression or another." Hamhut paused before he said what was on his mind, but then he let it out. "Lylin, could not the same have been said of our people?" She paused and turned. One of her favorite things about Hamhut was that she never knew what he was going to say. He was the only intelligent creature on Earth whose acts she could not preempt, the only person she could have a real conversation with. Should she speak to one of the humans, she would always know their every coming response, provided she stayed the course and delivered the words intended. She climbed down and stood on his forearm and looked out at the path in front of them with her eyes at the same height from the ground as his, and in a voice just above a whisper, she said, "The same could be said of our people, Hamhut, but I could forgive them. They were deserving of mercy. I only wish I would have realized it sooner." They waded on through the waves, made landfall, stole some clothes for Lylin, had their 3 heads, and went east to await her death. They spent what days they could together, enjoying each other's company among the blossoming trees and wildflowers, dancing under moonlight and laughing with one another. But when the time came, she ordered her love away, and before she plunged a dagger into her own heart alone in the wilds of China, she spoke to him over the wind, as she always did upon the arrival of her death, and said, "Until next we meet, farewell, my love." Then she was dead again, and again Hamhut was alone. Daniel Dwyer 10, April 30th, 2030 AD. Nobody had believed her, not her husband, not her mother. They all just said the same thing, that she must have imagined it when the spirit demanded Nathaniel's pacifier from her all those years ago. They said that she'd been drinking and that maybe the trauma of being scratched so hard on the face by her rotten child in combination with being intoxicated manifested a hallucination. Amanda knew that it was real, that she had seen with her own eyes a ghost, a terribly intimidating ghost who seemed to be concerned for her son for some reason. So she gave the child whatever he desired. She was so fearful of seeing the dark spirit again that she submitted to her terrible child's every whim. It cost her everything. She was no longer Amanda Reddington. She was Nathaniel Reddington's mother, and little more besides. She gave in to his demands so often that she wound up secretly racking up a great amount of debt, and had maxed out 2 high-limit credit cards just in the past 2 years. When Ed Reddington discovered that she'd been spending so much, he demanded that she not only cease spending so much on toys and trips for the boy, but also go to work for the first time since they'd married to help pay off the debt. She hadn't worked in ages and had no professional skills, but she reluctantly abided, and had just gone on her first interview with little 6-year-old Nathaniel in tow. Despite the fact that she had brought her child with her, the interview seemed to go well. At least she felt good about it. It was a phone bank where she would be placing calls, attempting to get people to complete surveys about random topics. Not the most thrilling line of employment, but it meant that she could at least start to make amends to her husband. Nathaniel had complained at the prospect of the notion and flat out said that he didn't want her to work, but she reasoned with him that she needed money to buy him things, and he eventually consented, much to her relief. She felt good. She was relatively certain that she'd gotten the job, and she smiled as they walked along the exterior corridor of the Crawford Business Plaza, and was still smiling as the elevator door opened to receive them. They were on the 4th floor when they boarded the elevator. Then on the way down to the 1st floor, her smile faded a bit as a suspicious-looking man got onto the elevator when it stopped on the 3rd floor. She was always a little leery of black people, but this guy looked particularly troublesome, and he eyed both of them up and down as he trotted onto the elevator. Maybe it was because she secured her purse and pulled Nathaniel in tighter that made him decide to do it, because he felt insulted. Whatever his reasoning, Alfonso Hamilton decided at that moment that he was going to rob her. At first, he said it in a calm voice. "Give me your purse." Shocked, Amanda said, "What?" Then he grabbed for her bag and said, "I said, give me your motherfucking purse." A struggle ensued between the two of them, and Nathaniel backed away into the corner and watched, terrified for his mother. She finally surrendered her purse to him and fell to the floor. He opened it and started rummaging through it. Then, mere moments before the elevator doors would have opened, the man that had taken his mother's purse met Nathaniel's hateful gaze and said, "What the fuck you looking at?" Then, the spirit appeared between the boy and the robber, the spirit who had haunted Amanda Reddington's nightmares, Nathaniel's very real imaginary friend who he'd all but forgotten, and with his club-ended red right arm, he struck the first blow to the robber's face with such force that his feet actually hit the ceiling of the elevator as his head was crushed against the metal side and a giant hole was punched out of the side of the elevator. The lights went out, and Amanda screamed her gasping, high-pitched whine, bathed in a scattering faint red glow, the only light in the pitch-black elevator emanating from the glowing red ball at the end of the monster's arm. The spirit continued to beat the man even though he was clearly dead, throwing the dim light around as bits and pieces of him flew this way and that. It seemed that every time the spirit stopped to consult the ball that was its hand, it became only more enraged and beat the mush of a corpse even harder and more furiously. The elevator jumped and rocked underneath them, causing the mother and son to be knocked around on the other side, and they both held onto the wooden awnings from their corners. Amanda cried and screamed the whole time, but Nathaniel watched with great pleasure and didn't even blink as blood splattered on his face. Emergency lighting attempted to come on, but only lit the elevator car with an occasional flash as it struggled against the violent shaking of the structure. The enraged destruction of Alfonso Hamilton continued for several minutes until nothing remained of him but smeared and smashed blood, pus, and hair. Not one of his organs, not even his skin, were recognizable. His teeth had even been smashed to dust. The entire left half of the elevator was completely annihilated, and daylight could actually be seen from where parts of the cement structure that housed the elevator shaft had also been obliterated. Finally, it stopped and looked into its red ball hand, and then it disappeared, taking the dim light with it. A little surveillance camera was embedded behind a glass plate on the side of the elevator closest to the door. Before it had lost power, it managed to capture the first 2 seconds of what had transpired, and the security guard who first reviewed the video almost immediately uploaded the footage to the internet. The first view of the short clip occurred before emergency services had even arrived at the plaza. The world at large would finally get its first glimpse of their future savior. The Shadow Man was real.